Hi, Helen.
Hi.
So, where are the other guys? Here
Uh,
they come.
ah,
There's Rachel.
Hello.
Hi.
We're just waiting for Steve.
Awesome.
And everybody can hear us now. So, um, welcome. We're just waiting for Steve to come on. While we wait for him, I'll just let everybody know. Welcome to the Hub Cures speaker series. This is a bunch of speakers that are addressing the Massachusetts response to the pandemic. And it's leading up to the 13th annual MALSI conference, which will be held on August 20th, also virtually. And you can register at the MALSI link. I am just going to go see what's happening with Steve.
There we go.
Oh,
Hi, Rachel. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Now I think we've lost Vinit.
I know.
He came to find you.
I'm here,
There
but
you
Steve,
go.
it's now your show. So you're on broadcast. Everybody's listening and watching you.
Great. Thank you very much, Vinit. Let me first introduce myself. My name is Steve London. I'm a partner in the Boston office of the law firm Troutman Pepper. Troutman Pepper is a full service law firm with about 1,100 lawyers in 23 offices throughout the country. I've spent my entire career working with entrepreneurs and their companies, partnering with them throughout the world to help change the world and improve people's lives. I focus the majority of my time with clients in the life sciences world. And this panel is the next in the Hub Cures speaker series. The Hub Cures series is all about Massachusetts' response to the pandemic, and it really is leading up to the August 20 MALSI event, for which most of you have probably already received notices and flyers. As a general matter, I'm proud to be part of this Massachusetts environment, which has really been a significant leader in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. All of the constituencies in this incredible ecosystem have stepped up in a collaborative, selfless, extraordinary and ways to address this health crisis through developments in diagnostics, therapeutics, data analytics, public policy, and more. So this panel this afternoon, we're really privileged to have two highly accomplished people whose background, expertise, and experience has in part relates to the societal impacts of the COVID-19 crisis. And by way of very brief introduction, first we have Dr. Hellen Amuguni, who is an associate professor in the Department of Infectious Disease and Global Health at the Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine at Tufts. She has a dual appointment in the Department of Public Health and Community Medicine at the School of Medicine at Tufts. Also with us is Rachael Dier, a multimedia storyteller, amplifying the voices of our communities. She recently graduated from Boston University with her MA in Emerging Media Studies. Rachael currently serves as a program manager and UX lead with the Boston University's Spark, a technology incubator and experimental learning lab. I'd like this to be a very flexible, interactive dialogue among our panelists and encourage our guests who are listening in and watching to share their comments with the comment and chat room, and I'll try to address those comments or direct them to our panelists. To start us off, maybe I can ask first Hellen and then Rachael to give us a little bit more background on you and what you've been doing and how your work recently relates to our topic of the COVID-19 impact on gender and race. So Hellen, maybe start us off with your background.
Thank you so much, Steve, for this invitation and for this opportunity to be part of this series. I'm faculty at the Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine, Tufts University. I'm a veterinarian by training, but I went on and did my PhD in infectious disease, and I have a master's degree in gender and community development. And so I always say that I work at the intersect of human, animal, and environmental issues called the One Health trifecta. And so the past maybe 8-9 years, I worked on a USAID project called Emerging Pandemic Threat. And as part of this project, the focus was to build capacity for countries across the world to be able to respond to a pandemic like this. And this happened, the US set up this system right after the Ebola outbreak and thought we need a system to help countries sort of respond to this. And so I worked in the Horn of Africa in 8 countries, actually, in Southeast Asia, 4 countries, doing a lot of pandemic preparedness training, as well as preparation and response and allowing countries to use a One Health approach. I also have some projects that are related to gender and livestock vaccination and the role of women and men, as well as decision making, their access to resources, and how that allows them to improve their livelihoods. And these projects are mainly in Africa as well. I've worked in Africa most of my life. So they're also in East Africa, looking at women and how empowered they can be. And we ended up doing a study actually related to COVID-19 when COVID-19 started, to look at the impacts of COVID-19 on households, on rural households in different countries in Africa. And I'll share a bit of that information later on. And then my most recent work that I'm doing right now is actually focused on sex and gender. I think we might have an understanding that with the current COVID-19, a lot of men ended up dying in most countries. The majority of people who died across the world, except for the state of Massachusetts, were men. In China, they said about 67% of deaths, mortality, were related to men. In Italy, actually 80% of the people who died were male compared to female. And so with that in mind, we thought, what's causing that? And that's sort of the story across the world, across the whole world. What would it be that's causing that? What's the impact? What are the risks? And what are the consequences? And so I'm currently looking at that, looking at sex and gender, which are 2 different things. Is it the impact of sex? Is it because they're males? And people have come up and said maybe there's an immunological response that causes this cytokine storm. Men react a lot more to that. Or it could be hormonal because of testosterone, but also it could be gender factors. So what are the gender risks? Maybe behavioral factors, risk related to roles, to gender roles. So that's sort of my latest study that I'm doing. I'm looking at both sex and gender and how they relate to the COVID-19.
Thank you very much. And we'll come back to several of those topics that you just raised. Rachael, maybe give us your background and the research you've done.
Totally. So I started my academic career in the field of English literature, and I was really intrigued at how traditional media could be used as a means of amplifying the voices of the voiceless rather than speaking for them. And as my interest in that area grew, I branched outside of traditional communications and looked into emerging media, which is why I ventured into the master's program that I did. And as I did that, I also expanded my interest into social scientific research. So studying how social identity and social representation coincides with one's experience and how the multitude of factors of housing, healthcare, just everyday life is shaped by one's social identity. And so my most recent research has looked into the multiple facets of activism, specifically in the United States, and how when looking at the Black Lives Matter movement, while looking at recent women's rights movements, the multitude of factors and the multitude of intersectionality affects the representation of activism. So that was my most recent research. And then that branched into, prior to the pandemic, looking at how representation of social identity online affects the day-to-day life outside of online communities. So oftentimes there's this perception that the interactions taking place online stay online, and they don't go outside of that, outside of one's cell phone, outside of the internet, and they do, which has been seen during the pandemic. And so that led up into the research I did most recently this past summer with a hackathon with Boston University called the Global Resiliency Challenge. And what we looked at was how hate speech was influenced by the pandemic. And while we had some pre-existing assumptions, it was drastically worse than what we even imagined. And so looking at how the pandemic has affected many individuals outside of the internet, a lot of the rhetoric is how we analyze Twitter rhetoric, but it expands outside of that. And we've seen that about how many people, whether it's just day-to-day life or healthcare or housing, a lot of people are being affected by this pandemic. And we specifically analyzed that based off race. And so taking that research, we've now been able to start works on how to take the research we've done and provide support for those affected, specifically in Massachusetts, though we were looking at the United States and beyond. And not to get too much into that research, but it's been a lot of my work looks at how to bring awareness to the realities many global citizens face and how to allow them to speak for themselves and to provide them with resources to better the situations they're in.
So what's the correlation, Rachael? Mm-hmm. As Hellen said, the actual physical impact on health has disproportionately affected men.
Yeah.
Where then does this COVID-19 have an impact on hate, mm-hmm. whether it's hate from a racial standpoint, ethnic standpoint, you name it? What's the connection?
Yeah. Unfortunately, when it comes to the discussion on race, I went into the research with a lot of ignorance because in my day-to-day life, that's not something I ever worry about. I never worry about encountering prejudice upon race. And so looking into it, unfortunately, my team and I realized that the hate speech we found was pre-existing to the pandemic. It was there. But unfortunately, with the pandemic, because it started in China, there was this insurgence of hate in that area. And we did a lot of background research, a lot of sociological research, because my expertise is qualitative research. So unfortunately, while this pandemic is something that no one alive today has ever experienced before, situations like this have happened before. And when people are afraid, they lash out. Mm-hmm. And we've seen, whether it be during the Ebola crisis or when there was swine flu during our experience, but even before then, during the Spanish flu, just people lash out, and the pre-existing racism and sexism that is integrated into our society, into the fibers of our society, lash out and are expanded. And so when we were looking at the pandemic, we compared on Twitter the rhetoric being shared prior to the pandemic. Then when the illness was introduced in China, because in many Western countries, including the United States, people weren't worried about it. They thought it wasn't our problem. At least that was the common opinion. And then we looked at it when the illness spread over here. And so the rhetoric was pre-existing. It just blew up in proportion once the pandemic grew and the fear grew. And there was also an increase in new language being constructed. So with the fear increasing, so did the lexicon. Language was increasing. Different words were emerging out of the fear. And with the sociological research we did while interviewing people, it allowed them to compartmentalize with this abstract thought, because a virus is something we can't see. And so the fear they had in their mind rationalized this idea of coming up with that terminology because it made it real. They were able to blame someone for what was happening rather than it's a virus. Mm-hmm. And so that was really heartbreaking to see, but show that there's a real problem.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so that seemed to be focused on China.
Yeah.
Has it manifested itself in race as well?
100%. Unfortunately, when looking at the rhetoric online, it did start with rhetoric specifically directed to Chinese individuals. Mm-hmm. However, as the pandemic spread, so did the target pool, and it became more so, at least in the United States. We specifically looked at English-speaking countries, or at least posts online and posts on Twitter that were in English. Mm-hmm. And it grew, and it became anyone who appeared to identify as Asian. And so it grew and grew, and it expanded outside of just rhetoric directed toward Chinese or China as a country, and towards Asian Americans, Asian individuals, and anyone who identified or they presumed were Asian. And while the rhetoric was housed obviously on Twitter, very quickly there were documentations of, at first in the beginning of the pandemic, it was a lot of racism. Mm-hmm. And then while the racism grew, there were documentations of racist acts. So Asian Americans started speaking out and saying, this is happening to me. I went to the store and I was verbally attacked. And so there was this clear connection between the rhetoric online and the racism online, and then it being brought into the real world and people being hurt or verbally attacked.
Got it.
Yeah.
So let me switch gears for a minute and come back to the topic, Helen, you raised earlier about sex, gender, from a healthcare standpoint, disproportionate impact on men. Let me challenge that because I guess there are different ways of calculating impact. One is actually on health, but also other social and economic impact. And what I sense is with work from home, with childcare responsibilities, the burden tends to fall more on women than on men. I even read an interesting piece that when surveyed most men said that they share equally, and when surveyed, most women said no, they don't. So maybe share a little bit of your thoughts on this impact from gender, sex, but expand out from just pure health impact.
Okay, and I do want to restate that the impact I'm talking about, that when I talked about it, I just meant that men were dying more from the pandemic. But the impact of the pandemic is actually a lot more on women and men. And I'll break that down a little bit. And so, for example, if we look at exposure for a pandemic to be there, who is more exposed? From a gender perspective, we understand that actually, if you look at the healthcare providers across the world, or the people who are the essential workers, around 70% of them are women. And so the people who are being exposed more, who are in the healthcare industry, who are in the leisure industry, the people who are in the hospitality industry, a lot of them are women. And so you find that a lot of them are really exposed to this pandemic more than men. And that happens a lot. And then the second thing in relation to that is I'm going to bring in race, because you can't talk about women and not talk about women of color, for example, you know? So in that case, you find that even with race, it is women, but a lot more women of color are affected because they're the ones in the low income jobs. They're the ones who are working in supermarkets. They're the ones who are doing the daycare. They're the ones who, you know, those common essential workers. The second thing that I want to say is the other impact, before I come to what you talked about, working from home, is joblessness. So we know that actually, as it stands right now, 70% of the people who lost their jobs in this pandemic were women, you know? And when the unemployment rate was around 13% for men or 12%, it was more than 15% for women, and almost 19% for people of color. And even right now, most of the businesses that were affected are those of women. You know, so if you think about it in that sense, that they're losing their economic power, they are losing their access to some of the things that they had. So it's affecting women in that way. And also access to healthcare. If we think about access to healthcare, people who are struggling before are now struggling even more at this time. And we think about what you were talking about at the beginning, Steve, taking responsibility in the home. I think many of us have been seeing this because of working from home, and there are two categories of people. There are those who are able to work from home. There are those who are not able to work from home. So those who are essential workers can't work from home, you know, so they still have to go to work. Who are those people? What increased percentage are those? Most of them, like I said, are women. And they're really exposed to that because they're the essential workers. But those who are able to work from home, paper came out actually a few days ago that says men have almost 5 hours of uninterrupted work. Women have about 2 hours of uninterrupted work because they have to take care of the unpaid labor. It's been standard across most countries. They still have to do the cooking, they still have to do the cleaning most of the time, but they still have to do the education of the children. They're responsible for the health care. Who is it that's telling everyone to put on a mask in the house? Who's running after people to ensure that they're washing their hands and they're doing all those things? Most of the time, it's the women. They still have full-time jobs. They still have to work their full-time jobs from home. But on top of that, they have to do all these other unpaid labor, what usually we call reproductive work, at a higher rate. I think a lot of men are acknowledging that it is a lot of work. Men are helping out at home, but it is a moment of clarity for a lot of them to understand, oh, actually, this is a lot of work. And hopefully that's a point of change. You know, that will be something that people can take away and use it to change policies.
Yeah. So I think we can categorize this, I think, based on kind of a socioeconomic level too. Yes. So you refer to the essential workers, many of whom, if they're in the grocery stores or in certain kinds of healthcare providers, are the lower paid workers that can't work from home. So from a social policy, that's a demographic that requires its own kind of policy. Then on the other end of the spectrum are those who are able to work from home, who typically have higher paying, more white collar kind of jobs, that if they start being furloughed or losing their jobs from that standpoint, those are many of the jobs for which we have been arguing the workplace is not diverse enough. So who is losing their jobs? Is it the middle-aged white male who's been in that job for a long time? Or is it a woman of color who is moving up the ranks of the company, but maybe last in, first out? Talk to me a little bit about how this information that we're learning about the pandemic can be turned into changing social policy and impacting in a positive way the progress that people are hoping that we're making on this diversity spectrum.
Okay. I can probably make some comments and then Rachel can too on this. One of the things that I think we are seeing is that it's just being exacerbated by the pandemic. You know, this systemic racism and gender inequity has been there, for a very long time. Like I mentioned at the beginning, if we look at the people who are going to work, 70% of them are women, and equally people of color. They're holding the low minimum paying jobs. And most of the time, that's because there's been lack of access to maybe education or education opportunities. There's been lack of access to housing. There's been lack of access to healthcare. And we also know that even looking at African Americans, for example, a lot of them, they're probably 2.5 times more likely to die in this pandemic than white people. And a lot of it is because of the comorbidities that existed. They say for this disease, people with underlying conditions are going to be struck more. If you think about asthma, an African-American family is 4 times more likely to have asthma, just because of the places where they're living, the kind of air pollution that's there, the kind of the environment that they live in, things like that. So these are things that have existed. And we hope that with this pandemic, that it's an opportunity to actually reflect back and say, we need to have a change, because it's something that has been talked about, something that's been explained. Hopefully it's an opportunity for people to think, what policies can we put in place? Just thinking about women. Could people get paid leave? Could people get sick leave? Could women be able to work from home and do other, put in place systems that are flexible enough for them to be able to work from home? Because a lot of women actually at the end of this pandemic are not going to be able to go back to work. Because think about childcare. We're still struggling with how is childcare going to work. And by the way, I forgot to mention that 91% of daycare centers are actually owned by women. So if you think about that, they've all been closed. So what's their source of income right now if 91% are owned by women? And maybe some of them are very small businesses that did not benefit from the CARES Act. We know that some businesses were not even touched by that. So they're shutting down, they're closing, they might not be able to come back. So I think it's an opportunity to think and reflect on what we can do differently.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think all of what you said is just resonates with everything that's going on. And also my past research and activism, a huge component of public policy is activism. And specifically in the US, many citizens have been taken aback by the displays of activism since the pandemic. And there was this really brilliant paper released recently. I can't remember the name of it. I'm happy to share it with anyone who's interested, that looks at the rate of individuals, specifically people of color, many which women of color, who lost their jobs, and the surge of people able to display forms of activism. So people who before had to work more than 9 to 5 all day long suddenly are jobless, and they're able to go out and fight for their rights and are able to march every day. And though those forms of activism have been displayed before, there's this huge surgence of people who no longer are able to work, who are able to go out and show those means of activism. And that's a huge problem, that people before were tied to work and weren't able to go out and point out changes in policy and what needed to be, progressed. And so tying that into my own research of late, it shows an enormous amount of privilege to look at the people who are able to be online and take part in the discourse online from a day-to-day life. I mean, when you're working from home, you're able to do that if you're not tied to a bunch of different things. You're able to tweet whatever you want. But the people who are essential workers, who they don't have that opportunity. They're not able to take time whenever they want to just tweet whatever they want. And that's a huge tie to that too, to see the rhetoric and the discourse online and how that's oftentimes just separate from the people being actually affected by it. And that's been huge of late with the pandemic, seeing the amount of people who have lost their jobs and the people who are forced to go to work. All of that is being displayed online. And it's unfortunate that it had to take a global pandemic for people to start being aware of, again, the systemic acts of racism and sexism, not just in this country, but globally. But this pandemic definitely put a spotlight on it.
So how do you give?
I probably,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, but Rachel, I can add something to that. Like, everyone sort of assumes that everybody has equal access to everything. A friend of mine was giving me an example. Like, she's a professor in a community college, and all schools went online. And the assumption is that students will be able to attend classes online. But her college has a lot of people of color. Yeah. They were not able, because they were essential workers and they were required to work double time. So they ended up missing a lot of the courses that were being offered in the whole spring semester because they could not do it, But everyone thinks, a lot of us think we are able to work from home. So, and maybe we sit and complain like, why am I sitting at home? When there are people who really, they can't afford not to go to work. Yeah. And because they are going to work and doing double work, they're actually missing out on their education. They're not able to participate in education. A couple of years down the road, they will still be in that low minimum wage job. So even it blocks their upward mobility, even if they wanted to. Yeah.
So how do you give voice to those people? And I'll give you another kind of demographic example with online learning for people at the lowest economic levels who may not have access to the internet, whose children don't have the luxury of a computer or multiple computers within the home, or parents who do not speak English or who have not been educated in math and science and reading to help their kids learn from home. How do you give voice to all of those people in this scenario?
I would say that, honestly, those are some of the people that have been left behind. And we can try to give voice to them by talking about this and sort of sharing what's happening. I know that many schools, many school districts and like superintendents recognized like the communities where this would happen. And so they sort of set out a plan to be able to reach out to those families and to have more teachers working with them directly. But everyone expects parents to be able to teach their children. How do you teach your children if you don't even speak their language of study? Think about it. Or maybe the education is in English. You're a Spanish woman, or you're from Haiti, or you're from somewhere, else you don't even speak. So, and you can actually look back and see the long-term impacts of that. So I would say that I think this is where activism comes in. and raising the voice, being able, for those of us who are able to speak on behalf of those people, actually speaking on behalf of them and saying, hey, if this is the way you're going to do it, you have to recognize that there are people who are still disadvantaged in this scenario as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and specifically looking at students in Boston, you brought up such great points. There are so many students who, when school went remote, they didn't have computers at home. What were they supposed to do? They couldn't go to a library. Everything was shut down because it's a pandemic. So all of a sudden, these students are in an environment where not only can they not learn, they can't speak for themselves. They can't go online and tweet that. I'm using Twitter because that's what we use for the analysis, but they can't go online and even email someone and say, hey, I'm not being heard. Their voice cannot be amplified. And that shows the problem, that while the internet allows us to amplify our own voices and I can communicate to people all over the world, there are people, when a situation like this happens where there's a pandemic and they're forced to go home and they have no access, they're voiceless. No one's there to listen to them. And who's there to help them? And so just like you said, it's so important to talk about these topics, but also move forward and say, what is the solution? What can we do to help these people? Because these students, and we could talk about it all day, but what are we going to do to help these students who are sitting at home and have no internet access? Their parents don't speak English, so they can't help them with their studies. Or their parents are essential workers. They have to go work. They can't stay and help the child learn. There's so many layers. I completely agree.
Right. And I think the challenge here is that the policymakers are often people like the three of us who have been relatively fortunate to have good paying jobs, career paths, etc. And I look around and I'm working from home and I'm in what I would consider a very, very lucky situation. I don't have to worry about whether I'm going to be hungry tomorrow or whether, I'm going to have to work all day long and who's going to watch my children, who's going to teach them. These are policymakers that I think need to be reminded of a constituency and a demographic that tend to be overlooked or lost. And to me, that's the most important message for our policymakers, to remember them and not forget them.
I would say that that's really important. The thing about policymakers, though, is that policymakers need evidence. That's why we do a lot of research, is that if I have the evidence that shows what's happening, I can go to the state and I can present that to my senator or someone else, and I can argue, here is the evidence to show this. And so it's really, really important that most of the time we just don't talk with anecdotal, information, that we actually have the evidence and we go out and we provide that evidence to the policymakers. And as well, I think the onus is upon us to be the activists, to speak for everyone. Even if I'm comfortable in my house and half my class is missing, I should not be comfortable if I'm only teaching half the class. Where is the other half? What's happening to them? My job is to uplift people and to raise them up and to help them move on. And so if they're missing, I should be able to go out and find out what's going on and what can I do in relation to that. Mm-hmm. I did want to respond. I think there's a question in the chat. I don't know if I can quickly just add something. I think someone asked why more women are dying in Massachusetts than men. So Massachusetts is one of those states that has actually gone the opposite way, and it has a lot more women dying of COVID-19 than men. And I want to say that that's one of the things that we're trying to find out. There are assumptions that it's because maybe there's a very high number of older women in Massachusetts with a lot of these comorbidities, and so that's why, but we don't really know the reasons. So that's one of the things we're doing. We're going to be looking at in our research as we look at sex and gender, we're going to be analyzing, looking at the state of Massachusetts as well, and comparing with other states and thinking through what behavioral risks, what roles, what is it that places these women in a higher position of danger in this state than in other places.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And there's another question that was posed that asks you to comment on the intersection of the pandemic on both human health and animal health. I will say, as a dog lover, while I think our pets are living a dream world right now because so many of their owners are home and there on a regular basis, the potential impact down the road when they go back to work could be quite devastating on those animals because they're not used to it. But I on a light, it's an important one. But any thoughts or comments on that?
Okay, so I can approach that from two. And I actually saw a cartoon that showed like cats on microscopes doing research because they're like, these people need to get back to work because the owners are too much at home. But just starting with animals, human and animal interactions. If you remember where the pandemic started, because where the virus came from, it's supposedly started from the wet market, which is a market in China where they sell porcupines, they sell chicken, they sell, all kinds of animals mixing together. We know that one of the drivers, and that's why I was telling you that I told my class in January that this was going to be a pandemic. One of the drivers of pandemics or emerging diseases is human interactions with animals. The fact that we've interfered with animal habitats, we've destroyed deforestation, climate change, all these drive pandemics. And so this was bound to happen. We should not be surprised. And we say that 5 new diseases emerge every year, 5 new infectious diseases emerge every year. 3 of them are of animal origin. They're zoonotic in nature every year. And so that's something that's really important to keep in mind. But as far as our animals getting COVID-19, I think it's been shown there are a few dogs, there are a few tigers and cats that have shown symptoms and signs. But the general idea is that animal lovers and animal owners shouldn't worry about that because it's not like they're going to transmit it to each other or something. I think so it hasn't been studied. I have a colleague of mine who's studying it now. It hasn't been studied much to show why those animals, but they think that cats, animals of the cat family, might have a little susceptibility. I don't know. I don't have the science to say that. And yet, I can actually agree with you that when people go back to work, I think animals are going to feel quite lonely. And we've seen, I have a friend whose cat is on antidepressants, by the way. So I know that happens. And so I think families need to prepare for that. Families need to be ready and to prepare for that. As well, I think people are also going to face that same thing because if you've been used to being together with your family all the time, that separation is going to happen when you eventually have to go back to work. I hope that the pandemic, it's not going to be the new normal. I mean, the normal as we knew it is going to be different, and that companies and organizations can see the importance of people working from home and can see how much work has been done, and that it will change and allow people to begin to do things differently. Telehealth, telework has actually been very successful.
So what's and we're pretty much wound down to the end of our panel, but maybe I'll give Rachael an opportunity for some closing words. What's the call to action? What's the call to action? We can't solve all of these problems in 5 minutes, but on trying to improve where we are based on what we've learned.
A lot of what we've seen alongside with the pandemic is an increase in awareness, and that's come as a shock to a lot of people. But that awareness is integral to progression in healthcare and housing, in an array of socioeconomic issues. But in order for people to become aware, we need to increase accessibility to education and knowledge in general. And I think that's at the core of a lot of issues we've seen. Is, for me, prior to my research on xenophobia and xenophobia in relation to COVID-19, I was ignorant to it. I was ignorant to a lot of what many Asian Americans and Asian individuals all over the world face. And that's part of the problem, is increasing that awareness and understanding. And in order for more people to be aware, we need to increase accessibility. So the students who are at home and don't have internet access, that's a problem. The people who have to work all day long as essential workers, they don't have the ability or the energy at the end of the day to go out and to learn more about these issues that aren't critical to their day-to-day life. And so looking at those issues and helping people not only become more accessible to education and to awareness of what's going on, but to have the platform to be able to speak for themselves. Because just like we spoke about, a lot of people can't. And so it's important for us to give them the platform and the ability to speak for themselves, at least from my research.
So I want to, on behalf of the Hub Speaker Series, I want to thank Rachael, Hellen, for your thoughts and comments. I really think that we've come at this COVID-19 pandemic from a unique perspective that we have not yet shared in the prior series. So thank you very much. And I think we will now open this up, if Vinit can help me do that, to people networking among Hellen, Rachael, and myself, and the other people who have participated at the different tables. So thank you very much. And another shout out for Malsi on August, I got to get the date, August 20th. So please sign up if you haven't already done so. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having